In this lesson, we're going to continue discussing strokes. If you'd like to follow along, go under your File menu to Open, and in the Working Files folder, go into Chapter number 13 and select Stroke Secrets and just click Open. Before we begin, let's scroll down to page number 2 in this document. In this lesson, we're going to be discussing the more advanced stroke features, including some secrets. I'm going to go to my selection tool and select this square in the upper left-hand corner. And I'm going to zoom in a bit with my zoom tool so we can better see what's going on. And go back to my selection tool, and we're going to talk about making your own custom dashes. The way you do that is select an object with a stroke, go under the type of stroke pop-up, and select the very last item, which is dashed. And this allows you to create totally custom dashes. But first, let's talk about corners. By default, anytime you have dashes, they're automatically going to adjust into the corners so that the corners are all exactly the same. You can control these options for the corners in this pop-up menu in the dash section. By default, it is adjusting the dashes and gaps to make the corners perfect. Let me go to none. If there were no adjustments to the dashes or gaps, this is what it would look like. I could also adjust just the dashes, or I could adjust just the gaps. So you have a lot of control about the way the dashes will meet in the corners. Why is it important that all the corners are the same? Well, if you're creating a coupon border, you really want it to look like this, or else it's just not going to look like a coupon. Let me go back under the corner options and select the default, which is adjust dashes and gaps. So it's adjusting both to make the corners perfectly the same, which of course looks a lot better. But let's get into these fields down the bottom. By default, if I choose dashed from my type pop-up menu, I'm going to get a 12-point dash, and there's nothing in the gap field. If there's nothing in the gap field, that is also going to be 12 points. It's going to pick up whatever is in that first dash field. But let's say I wanted to make a dash that had a much narrower gap. How about 6 points? I'm just going to type a 6 and hit my tab key to go to the next field. And you can see now the gaps are much narrower. But why are there so many extra fields? I could actually set up totally custom dashes and gaps that repeat in a pattern. So my first dash is 12 points, my first gap is 6 points. Maybe my second dash in my pattern is 6 points. Nothing is going to happen until I hit my tab key to get to the next field. And now you can see it's beginning to set up pattern. Let me make my next gap 12. And I'm going to hit my tab key to get to the next field. And I wanted to point out that the corners are still meeting perfectly. So it's adjusting these numbers that I'm putting in for dashes and gaps to make the corners meet perfectly with exactly the same corner dash. I'm going to go to the next field and create a very thin dash. How about 2 points? And then a gap of 2 points. And I could hit my tab key again to apply this custom pattern, which is repeating over and over again. Let me show you. I'm going to zoom in even tighter. And you can see that it is a pattern that repeats over and over again. Really kind of cool. I'm going to fit my window by, on a Mac, hitting Command 0, and on a PC, Control 0. Now, let's talk about this dotted type of rule. You can see in the type pop-up when I select the dotted stroke with my selection tool, there is dotted, and it's actually Japanese dots, which are much closer together than the regular dotted stroke. But wouldn't it be cool if I can do something almost magical with gradients? Gradients, as you remember, are smooth blends between two colors. Let me go into my swatches panel, and I have a gradient down the bottom of the swatches called Dotted Gradient Fun. And I'm just going to apply it. And you can see that it is going from a very light purple to a very dark purple. But I actually want it to go the other direction. So I'm going to go to my gradient panel and just hit reverse. So now the darkest purple is to the left and the lightest purple is to the right. Now let's go back into the stroke panel and have some fun. For gap color, I'm going to apply that same gradient and let's see what happens. I'm going to go down to Dotted Gradient Fun in the gap color pop-up. And really kind of cool what it's doing. It almost looks like the dots are disappearing into nothing in the middle and then coming out the other end. Sets up a very interesting kind of look. Now, one of the things about strokes in InDesign, in other applications, if you were to add a stroke to type, it's not going to be typographically correct. What am I talking about? Well, let me go to my swatches panel, and I just selected my text frame with my selection tool. In order to apply a swatch to type, I can click on this T symbol in the swatches panel. Now, instead of applying the swatch to the frame itself, it's applying it to the type without having to select the type, so we can see what's going on. Now, if I were to add a black stroke, let me just click on my stroke to move it to the front so it's active and make sure that I have my type selected and apply a black stroke. And go to my stroke panel and increase the weight of that stroke. And I just wanted to point out that the entire stroke is to the outside. So no matter how thick I make the stroke, it's not going to go to the inside of the letter forms, which would really mess up the look of the type. And it's a great way to have typographers cringe. So in InDesign, if you add a stroke to your type, it's always going to be typographically correct. And those type designers are really smiling. Now, another problem with strokes. Let me zoom in on just the two pictures towards the upper right. And I just wanted to point out that I have a stroke around this image that has gaps. And because half of the stroke is inside of the frame, the picture is coming through the frame. Well, maybe I don't want it to look like that. Maybe I want to fill in that gap. Well, with that object selected, I can fill in the gap. Just go to Gap Color and choose Paper, which fills in the gaps to cover the image that was coming through the gap. There is another way to do this. If I select the next image towards the right, I could also change the alignment of the stroke to either the inside, so the picture is now peeking through both of the gaps, or to the outside, so the stroke is entirely outside of the graphic frame, so you can't see any of the contents of the graphic frame through the gaps. Why don't we zoom out a bit? I'm just going to hit Command or Control 0 to fit my page, and we're going to talk about creating your own custom strokes. I'm just going to select this one stroke with my selection tool. And why don't I zoom in on that? I'm just going to click and drag across it with my zoom tool and go back to my selection tool. Now, there is an options menu in the stroke panel, but there's not much under it. There's something called hide options, which makes most of the panel disappear. But there's also, let me just show those options. There's also something called stroke styles. And if I go in there, it's going to allow me to create totally custom strokes of different kinds. Why don't we click New to create a new totally custom stroke? Now, I can create dashes or dotted, but we're going to concentrate on stripe because they all pretty much work the same way. What I'm going to do is create a very thin, very thick, very thin stroke. I'm going to take the bottom arrow and move it up. I want to go to a width of 15%. So this is starting at 0% and it's ending at 15% into the stroke. Let me do the same thing at the bottom. I'm going to click and drag downward to 85% for the start, and the width of that is 15% of the total stroke. Well, let me create a very thick center rule in this stroke. I'm going to start at 25% and go down to 75%. Now, I didn't get exactly the right numbers. I'm going to change the start to 25 and click in the other field to apply it. So you can see it is very thin, very thick, very thin. Down the bottom, it says preview weight. You can't really see it all that well in a 5-point weight. Let me start increasing that. Let me go to the pop-up to do it much more quickly. If I'm using this stroke, I'm probably going to have to make it fairly thick for it to work because parts of it are so thin you may not be able to see them. Now, I'm going to name this. I'll call it very thin, very thick, very thin. And I could click either Add, which will add it to the pop-up in my stroke panel, or I could just click OK. If I click Add, I could create other custom strokes before I click OK. But I'm just going to click OK. And it's actually going to add it to the list here. But also, if I click OK, it's going to add it at the bottom of the pop-up for type of stroke. Let me apply that. And you can see it is very thin, very thick, very thin. And it will only work really well in thicker strokes. Let me increase the thickness of this stroke to show you. We're going to continue discussing color in the next lesson.